Search and Rescue by Kerry Hammond, Part 3. Well, once again, you guys have blown me away with your staggering amount of responses to my stories. There's no way I can respond to you individually, I'm afraid. So I'm just going to address some common things again, and then we'll move on. I'm going to write as many as I can think of, in addition to my friends' stories, and I probably won't get a chance to update again until I can answer some questions that I myself have for my superiors. Right, common questions I found you all had. First off, I am not comfortable talking about exactly where I work, unfortunately. In all reality, some of the things I mentioned here could get me in a lot of trouble or fired, so it's best I just don't discuss too much. I will say that I'm in the United States, and I will say I am in an area that is comprised of a great deal of wilderness. We are talking hundreds of miles of thick forest with a mountain range and a few lakes. There is still a great amount of interest in the stairs. And luckily for you, luckily for you guys, my friend has a story that I think you'll all be really interested in. I'll go into that more, a little bit more closer to the end of the update. As for whether or not I've ever thought of asking my superiors about them, I have. But again, don't want to risk my job. However, one of my former superiors no longer works as an SAR officer, and it's possible he may be willing to talk to me about it. I'll be speaking to him later in the week, and I will let you all know what comes of that. As far as advice on becoming an SAR officer goes, I think the best advice I can give you is to contact your local Forest Service office and see if they offer training courses, or what the qualifications are. I have to be honest, I've been doing this for years, and I started out as a volunteer helping out on SAR ops, and it's a great job, despite the occasional tragic situations, and I wouldn't want to do anything else, so if you're interested, do look into it. Anyway, let's move on to the stories. The first happened on a case that I went out on right after I got out of training, and I was still brand new to everything. Before I took this job, I was a volunteer, so I had a basic idea of what to expect. But on those calls, you're mostly dealing with finding lost people after vets have found signs of them. As an SAR officer, you go out for all kinds of cases, from animal bites to heart attacks. And this one, we got called in on early in the morning. It was a young couple who were up on one of the trails that goes by the lake. The husband was completely hysterical, and we couldn't figure out what was going on. We could hear the woman, and she was screaming in the background, and he was begging us to come up there right away. So we go, and when we get there, we see him holding his wife, and she's got something in her arms. She is screaming these awful, almost animal-like screams, and he's sobbing. He sees us, and he screams at us to help them to please get an ambulance up there. Now, obviously, we can't just drive an ambulance up the walking path. So we ask him if his wife needs help or if she can walk on her own. He's still hysterical, but he manages to tell us that it's not his wife that needs help. I go over while one of the vets tries to calm him down, and I ask the wife what's going on, and she is just rocking, holding something and shrieking over and over. I crouch down and I see that whatever she's holding, it's covering her with blood. And that's when I notice the sling on her front, and my heart sinks. I ask her to tell me what's going on, and I sort of try and pry her arms gently open so I can see what she's holding, and it's her baby, obviously dead. His head is caved in on one side, and he's covered in scratches. Now, I've seen dead bodies before, but there is something about this one that just hits me hard, and I have to take a second to compose myself. So I get up and I go get one of the vets who was standing by, and I tell him it's a dead kid, and he kind of pats me on the shoulder and says, "It's okay, I'll deal with it." It took us over an hour to get this woman to let us see her kid. Every time we try to take him from her, she flips out and tells us we can't have him, that he'll be okay if we just leave her alone and let her help him, but Eventually, one of the vets manages to calm her down and she gives us the body. We took it back to the med area, but when the EMTs showed up, they told us there was never any hope of saving the kid. He died instantly from the trauma to his head. I was good buddies with one of the nurses who met them at the hospital, and later she told me what had happened. Turns out the couple had been walking with the baby in the sling, and they stopped because the kid was fussing. The dad takes the kid and is holding him, looking out over this little gully by the path. The mom comes to stand next to him, but she ends up stepping on a loose patch of soil, and she trips, and she falls into the dad, who drops the kid, who ends up falling 20 feet down this little gully onto the rocks at the bottom. The dad climbed down and recovered the kid, but he had fallen right on his head, and he was dead by the time he got there. Baby was 15 months old. It was a total freak accident, a series of events that coalesced into the worst possible outcome, and probably one of the more awful calls I've been on. I haven't seen a lot of animal bites in my time as an SAR officer, mostly because there aren't that many animals that come around the area. I mean, there are bears, but they tend to stay pretty far away from people, and sightings are highly unusual. Most of the animals you'll see are small ones: coyotes, raccoons, skunks. What we do see frequently, though, are moose. And let me tell you, moose are nasty fuckers. They will chase after anything for any reason, and God help you if you get in between a female and its baby. One of the more amusing calls was a guy who got chased down by this absolutely massive male moose and was stuck up a tree. Took us almost an hour to get him down, and when he was finally on solid ground again, he looks at me and he says, "God damn! Them fuckers is big up close." I guess that's not really a scary story, but we still laugh about that one. This one's weird. I honestly don't know how I'd forgotten it, but it is by far the scariest thing that's happened to me. I guess maybe I've tried so long to forget about it that it just didn't come to mind right away. As someone who spends literally all of their time alone in the woods, you don't ever want to let yourself get scared of being alone or out in the middle of nowhere. That's why when you have experiences like this one, you tend to just forget about them and move on. This is, to date, the only thing that's ever made me seriously consider if this job is the right one for me, and I don't like talking about it much, but I'll do the best I can to remember it all, because, well, as I recall, this took place right at the end of spring. It was a typical lost child call. A 4-year-old girl had wandered away from her family's campsite and had been missing for about 2 hours. Her parents were despondent, told us what most parents do. "My kid would never wander away. She's so good about staying close. She's never done anything like this before." We assure the parents that we'll do everything we can to find her, and we spread out, standard search formation. Now, I was partnered with one of my good buddies, and we were sort of casually holding conversation while we hiked. I know, it sounds callous, right? But you kind of become desensitized when you've done this work long enough. It becomes the norm. And I think to a certain extent you have to learn to desensitize yourself in order to work this job. So we search for a good 2 hours, going well beyond where we think she'd be. And we come out of a small valley when something makes us both stop in unison. We freeze. We look at each other, and there is this sensation, like a plane depressurizing. My ears actually pop, and I have this odd sensation of having dropped about 10 feet. I start to ask my buddy if he felt that, but before I can, we hear the loudest sound I have ever heard in my life. It's almost like a freight train passing directly by us, but it's coming from every direction at once, including above and below. He screams something to me, but I can't hear him over this deafening roar. And understandably freaked out, we look all around us trying to find the source of the sound, but there is nothing. Neither of us sees anything, and of course, My first thought is landslide. We're not near any cliffs, and even if we were, it would have hit us by now. The sound just goes on, and we are trying to yell to each other, but even standing close together, we can't hear anything but this sound. And then, as suddenly as it starts, it stops. It was like someone threw a switch and cut it off. We stand there for a second, perfectly still, and slowly the normal sounds of the woods come back. And not unreasonably, he asks me, "What the fuck just happened?" But I just kind of shrug, and we stand there looking at each other for a minute. I get on the radio and ask if anyone else just heard the end of the fucking world, but no one else hears it, even though we're all within shouting distance of each other. So my buddy and I shrug it off and keep going. About an hour later, we all check up on the radios. No one's found the little girl. Most of the time, we won't search when it gets dark, but because we don't have any kind of lead on her, a few of us decide to keep going, including me and my buddy. We keep close together. We're calling out for every couple of minutes, and at this point, I am hoping beyond hope that we find her, because, I don't like kids, but the idea of them being out all alone in the dark, it's awful. The woods can be intimidating to kids in the daytime. At night, it's a whole different beast. We're not seeing any signs of her though, and we're not getting any responses. And around midnight, we decide to turn around and head back to the rendezvous point. We're about halfway back when my buddy stops and shines his light to the right of us into this really thick deadfall. So it's a group of dead trees. I ask him if he's heard a response, but he just tells me to be quiet a second and listen. I do. And in the distance, I hear what sounded like a kid crying. Now, we both obviously call the girl's name, listen for any kind of response, but it's just this really faint crying. We head in the direction of this deadfall and go around it, and we're calling her name over and over now. We get closer to the crying, and I start getting this weird feeling in my gut. And I tell my buddy that something doesn't feel right, and he tells me he feels the same way. Neither one of us can figure out what it is. But we stop where we are, and we call the girl's name again. And at the same time, we both figure it out. The crying is on a loop. It's the same little hitching sob, then wail, then quiet hiccup repeated over and over. It's exactly the same every time. And without saying another word, we both take off running. It's the only time I have ever lost my composure like that, but something about it was so incredibly wrong, and neither of us wanted to be there anymore. So we get back to the rendezvous and we ask if anyone else had heard anything strange. No one else knew what we were talking about. I know it sounds kind of anticlimactic, but that call fucked me up for a long time. As for the little girl, we never found a trace of her. We keep an eye out for her and all the other people we've never found, but frankly I doubt we'll ever find anything. Of the missing persons calls I've gone out on, only a handful have ever resulted in a complete disappearance, meaning no trace of the person and nobody ever found. But sometimes finding a body leads to more questions than answers. Here are some of the bodies we have found that have become infamous among our team. A teenage boy whose remains were recovered almost a year after he vanished. We found the top of his skull, 2 finger bones, and his camera almost 40 miles from where he was last seen. The camera was destroyed. The pelvis of an older man who had vanished a month earlier. That's all we found. The lower jaw and right foot of a 2-year-old boy on the highest peak of a ridge in the southern part of the park. The body of a 10-year-old girl with Down syndrome. almost 20 miles from where she'd vanished. She died of exposure 3 weeks after going missing, and all of her clothes were intact, except for her shoes and jacket. There were berries and cooked meat in her stomach when they did the autopsy. The coroner said it appears as if someone had been taking care of her. No suspects were ever identified. The frozen body of a 1-year-old baby, found a week after vanishing in the hollow trunk of a tree 10 miles from the area he was seen last. There was fresh milk found in his stomach. His tongue was gone. A single vertebrae and right kneecap of a 3-year-old girl found in the snow almost 20 miles from the campground her family had been at the previous summer. Now, on to a couple of the stories my friends told me. I mentioned that you were all interested in the stairs. You're in luck. He's had a closer encounter with them, though he doesn't have any explanation for them. He does have a little bit more experience with them than I do. My buddy has been an SAR officer for about 7 years. He started when he was a junior in college, and he had a very similar experience to me when he first encountered the stairs. In fact, his trainer told him almost the exact same thing mine did, which was never go up them, never go near them, don't touch them, don't descend them. For the first year, he did just that. But apparently his curiosity got the better of him, and on one call he broke away from the line and he went to go check a set of them out. He said they were about 10 miles from the path where a teenage girl had vanished, and the dogs were following a scent. He was on his own, lagging behind the main group, when he saw a set of stairs off to his left. They looked, he said, like they were from a new house, because the carpeting was pristine and white. He said that as he got closer, he didn't feel any different or hear any weird noises. I mean, he was expecting something to happen, like bleeding from his ears or collapsing, but he got right up next to them and didn't feel anything. The only thing he said that was odd was that there was absolutely no debris on the steps. No dirt, leaves, dust, anything. And there didn't appear to be any signs of insect or animal activity in the immediate area, and that was what really struck him as odd. It was less like things were avoiding them and more like they just happened to be in a relatively barren part of the forest. He touched the stairs and didn't feel anything except that sort of sticky feeling you get from new carpet. He made sure his radio was on, and he slowly climbed the stairs, and he said it was terrifying because of the way they'd been stigmatized. He really wasn't sure what was going to happen to him, in fact. He joked that half of him expected to be teleported to some other dimension, and the other half was waiting for a UFO to come swooping down. But he got to the top with a little event, and he stood there, looking around. But he said the longer he stood on the top step, the more he felt like he was doing something very, very wrong. He described it as the feeling you would get if you were in a part of a government building you have no business being in, as if someone was going to come and arrest you or shoot you in the back of the head at any second. He tried to brush it off, but the feeling got stronger and stronger, and that was when he realized he couldn't hear anything anymore. The sounds of the forest were gone. He couldn't hear his own breathing. It was like some kind of weird, awful tinnitus, but more oppressive. He climbed back down, rejoined the search, and didn't mention what he'd done. Here's the weird part. His trainer was waiting back at the welcome centre after the search ended for the day, and he cornered my buddy before he could leave. He said his trainer had this look of intense anger, and he asked what was wrong. "You went up them, didn't you?" My buddy said it wasn't phrased as a question. He asked how his trainer knew. The trainer just shook his head. "Because we didn't find her. The dog lost her scent." My buddy asked what that had to do with anything. The trainer asked how long he'd been on the stairs. My buddy said no more than a minute. The trainer gave him this really awful, almost dead-eyed look and told him that if he ever went up another set of stairs again, he'd be fired immediately. The trainer walked away, and I guess he's never answered any of the questions my buddy has asked him about it since. Now, my guy has been involved in a lot of missing persons cases where there's never been a trace of them found. I mentioned David Paulides, and my buddy said he can confirm that those stories are, for the most part, accurate. He said most of the time, if the person isn't found right away, they're never found. Or they're found weeks, months, or years later in places they can't possibly have gotten to. There's one story in particular he told me that really stood out, that involved a 5-year-old boy with a severe mental disability. This little boy vanished from a picnic area in the late fall. In addition to the mental disability, he was also physically handicapped, and his parents explained over and over that he simply could not have vanished. It was impossible. Someone had to have taken him. My buddy said they searched for this kid for weeks, going miles out of the accepted range, but it was like he'd never been there. The dogs couldn't pick up his scent anywhere, not even in the picnic area where he'd apparently vanished. Suspicion fell on the parents, obviously, but it was pretty clear they were devastated and hadn't done anything sinister to their kid. The search was concluded after about a month. My buddy said everyone had pretty much forgotten it by later in the winter. He was out on a training op in the snow on one of the higher peaks when he came across something. He said he saw it from far away at first, and when he got closer, he realized it was a shirt, frozen and sticking part way out of the powder. He recognized it as belonging to the kid because it had a distinctive pattern. About 20 yards away, he found the kid's body, lying partially buried in the snow. My buddy said there was no way the kid had been dead for any more than a few days, though he'd been missing for almost 3 months. The kid was curled around something, and when my buddy brushed off the snow to see what it was, he said he almost couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was a big chunk of ice, and it had been carved, crudely, to look sort of like a person. The kid was holding it so tight it had frostbitten his chest and hands, which my buddy could tell even with the decay that had taken place. He radioed the rest of the crew and they took the body off the mountain. Now he recapped all of this for me, and put it simply, there was no way this kid could have both survived for almost 3 months on his own or have gotten to the peak. There was no physical way this child could have walked 50 miles and ended up on top of a goddamn mountain. To top it off, there was nothing in the kid's stomach or colon. Nothing. Nothing. There wasn't even water. It was like my buddy had said. The kid had been taken off the face of the earth, put in suspended animation, and dropped on this mountain months later, only to die of exposure. He never got over that one. I can understand why. The last story I'll share from him was one that took place relatively recently. In fact, only a few months ago. They were out doing a recon for mountain lions because there had been several reports of sightings in the last couple of days. Now, one of our jobs is to scout out the areas where these animals are seen to ensure that if they are in the area, we can warn people off and close off those trails. He was out on his own in a very, very heavily forested part of the park towards dusk when he heard what sounded like a woman screaming in the distance. Now, as most of you know, when a mountain lion screams, it sounds almost exactly like a woman being brutally murdered. It's unsettling, but it's far from abnormal. My buddy radioed back and let Ops know that he'd heard one and that he was going to keep going to see if he could figure out where its territory started. He heard the mountain lion scream a couple more times, always from the same spot, and determined the approximate area of the mountain lion's territory. He was about to head back. And that was when he heard another scream, this time within a few yards of him. Now, of course, he freaks out and starts heading back at a much, much faster pace, because the last thing he wants to do is run into a goddamn mountain lion and get mauled to death. As he got back on the path and started heading back, though, the screaming followed him. So he started running. When he was about a mile from Ops, the screaming stopped, and he turned around to see if it was following him. It was almost night by this point, but he said, in the distance, just before the path rounded a corner, he could see what looked like a male figure. He called out to them, warned them that the paths were closed and that he needed to come back to the welcome centre, and the figure just stood there. So, after a while, my buddy started to walk over, and when he was about 10 yards away, the figure took, as he described, an impossibly long step towards him and let out the same scream my buddy had been hearing all night. My buddy didn't even say anything. He just turned and sprinted back to Ops, didn't even look behind him. By the time he got back, the screaming had moved back into the woods. He didn't mention it to anyone else, just said there was a mountain lion in the area and moved on. Just that they would need to close those paths until the animal could be located and moved. Now, this is kind of a huge wall of text, so I'm going to end this entry here. And also, I'm going to be heading out on a yearly training op tomorrow morning, so I'll be gone until early next week. But I'm going to be meeting with a lot of former trainers and buddies who work in other areas of the park, and I'll be asking around about any stories they'd like to share. I'm so glad you guys have been interested in these stories, and once I'm back from this op, I promise you I'll continue to share them. And that's the end of part 3.